Good afternoon, everyone in the room, and also good afternoon to everyone who is joining us online. My name is George Letsas, and I'm Professor of Legal Philosophy here at UCL. And I'm delighted to welcome everyone to tonight's seminar, which is part of the John Austin Seminar Series in Jurisprudence, organized by our Quain Center for Jurisprudence here at UCL. I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Professor David Enoch. David holds degrees in law and philosophy from Tel Aviv University before moving on to Clark for a judge, Justice Banish of the Israeli Supreme Court. Later, in 1998, he embarked on a PhD in philosophy at NYU University, which he completed in 2003. The philosophers who supervised his dissertation at NYU might perhaps be known to people here. They go by the names of Hartley Field, Thomas Nagel, and Derek Parfit, a dream team of supervisors, if there was ever one. The topic of David's doctoral dissertation was metaethics, and in particular, the idea of realism in normative domains, not least that of morality. David set out to provide a defense of moral realism at a time when it was not at all fashionable to do so in metaethics. In fact, at a time when realism was often ridiculed and thought that its implausibility was a starting point for any view in metaethics. Now, realism, as the name suggests, is roughly the idea that moral truths exist, and at least some statements about what is right and wrong are true, objectively speaking. But David sought to defend not just realism, but what he calls a robust form of realism. This realism is robust in at least two ways. First, in arguing that normative propositions are not only true and objective, but in a crucial sense, independent of people's responses to them. Independent, that is, from their attitudes, their desires, or their emotions towards them. Robust realism, in other words, is response independent. More broadly, it's a realism that treats moral facts as different from natural facts. That is, the facts that roughly are studied by the physical sciences. The second way in which David's realism is robust is that he sought to provide a positive defense of realism. And up until his dissertation, most realists would just spend time responding to objections against realism, rather than give a positive, robust defense of it. But for David, without a positive metaethical defense of realism, the whole business of morality, including defenses of rights and equality, is seriously under threat. His dissertation, several chapters of which appeared in the early 2000s as articles, culminated in the publication of a monograph entitled aptly Taking Morality Seriously, published in 2011 by Oxford University Press, to wide acclaim. Although by the time David published his book, realism in metaethics was not as uncommon as it was 20 years ago, things look quite different in the field of political theory. There, the late work of John Rawls, what he called political as opposed to metaphysical liberalism, was dominant, and I believe still is very influential in that field. The idea of political liberalism is meant to be metaethically very thin, not being based on a set of substantive, moral, or ethical values. Crucially, political liberalism involves the claim that the necessary condition for the legitimacy of government is that its legitimacy must be accessible to people. It must employ what Rawls called public reason. Political liberalism, in other words, makes a type of response dependence relevant to political morality. If political authority cannot be justified to each person as they see things and as they respond to things, then it cannot have any legitimacy over them. Now, it's not hard to see how this late Rawlsian framework is in tension with the robust realism as David understands it and defends it. And indeed, later on, in two important articles written in 2015 and 2017, David criticizes this Rawlsian framework in his article Against Public Reason and political philosophy and epistemology, the case of public reason. In one of the striking and my view very convincing claims in his critique is that the Rawlsian approach creates too big a gap between political philosophy and politics. This is because without a substantive, fully fledged commitment to moral values such as autonomy and equality, the political philosopher has very little to say about some hugely important matters of public debate that contemporary liberal societies face. For David, and I quote, the good political philosopher and the political activist should be allies. Their roles are in a way continuous. On top of his work on metaethics and moral realism, David has written on numerous other topics, on moral luck, on the permissibility of using statistical evidence in court, and the more justifiability of nudging. He has also written on general jurisprudence, a field in which he seemed initially to find little interest. I speculate here, perhaps because he holds, at least for the moment, a positivistic approach to law. Since 2003, David has held the joint appointment in law and philosophy at the Hebrew University. And in 2023, he was appointed to a chair in the philosophy of law at Oxford University, delivering his inaugural lecture last November. David has a unique style of doing philosophy, and those familiar with his work will know that. His writing flows effortlessly. It's as if it's a transcript of a casual conversation between friends, but with no compromise whatsoever on depth or nuance. He seems to be always one step ahead of his interlocutor in the argument, sometimes 2 or 3 steps. For today's seminar, David will pick up again on the topic of liberalism, which I believe forms part of a new, ambitious project he has to provide a fresh defense for liberalism. The talk, very aptly, is entitled Shameless Liberalism. And without further ado, David, I hand over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Joe. This was so lovely. I found myself thinking, I hope my mother listens to this. And in fact, she may be online, so it may be okay. So everybody's talking about liberalism crisis, and I'm sure there is one. Often what people have in mind when they talk about this crisis is a political crisis. And that is something that we as philosophers do not typically have a relative advantage about. I don't know, maybe we need the politicians to work on that, or the activists, or the PR people. And we are not sure that I'm not sure that the solution for this crisis will come from the philosopher's armchair. But this crisis also has some more theoretical parts to it. One natural thought is that the philosophical crisis, that the political crisis, and I'm sure there are more mistakes on the hand, that the political crisis exposes some deeper problem here. That perhaps what we see on the political level is the result of some deep philosophical theoretical problem at the heart of liberalism maturing, right? The kind of picture along these lines. And that's definitely a possibility. But I also want to note that it may be false. There's something childish about the hope that if some project fails, that's because there was some deep problem in that. That may be the case, but it need not be the case. It's possible that the political crisis is due to problems with implementing what is ultimately a true political philosophy, perhaps due to bad luck, perhaps due to other things altogether. So there's no guarantee that the political crisis is translated into a philosophical one. This paper will not be about making liberalism popular again, or anything of this kind, though if it does have that effect, I won't be disappointed. The crisis I'm interested in is more intellectual, and it's partly because of something that George already mentioned, because I believe due to the failure of the kind of dominant liberalism that we've seen in political philosophy, at least in political philosophy written in English in the past 40 years or so. So this is where philosophers do have a relative advantage, right? In highlighting problems with other accounts, and then maybe, although to a lesser extent, also with coming up with coming up with alternatives. I want to note that there will be no history here, right? So one way of going about this kind of stuff is to better understand the liberal canon to the extent that there is such a thing, and who interprets it better. I won't engage in those kinds of wars at all. There is a kind of megalomaniac hope in the background, and that's that the philosophical discussion done well will also be relevant politically. It will have the kind of political effect. By the time everyone reads my paper, then things will start improving the world. Or anyway, one thing will improve a tiny little bit, right? Something like this. I think this, of course, it's megalomaniac, that's put, but I don't think there's nothing to it, because one of the striking things about the kind of dominant liberalism that we've seen over the past decades is that it's not just, if I'm right, intellectually embarrassing. It's also politically very weak. It's extremely uninspiring. Here's one thing that I think is shows this nicely, although there's a strong anachronism going on. This is from Martin Luther King. Okay, the quote is on the handout. There is a dire need today in the 60s, for liberalism which is truly liberal. What we are witnessing today in so many northern communities is a sort of quasi-liberalism, which is based on the principle of looking sympathetically at all sides. It is a liberalism so bent on seeing all sides that it fails to become committed to either side. It is a liberalism that is so objectively analytical that it's not subjectively committed. It is a liberalism which is neither hot nor cold, but lukewarm. We call for a liberalism from the North which will be thoroughly committed to the ideal of racial justice and will not be deterred by the propaganda and subtle words of those who say, slow up for a while, we're pushing too fast. Now, there's a lot to be said about this quote. I won't get into it. I just want to flag that I disagree with the last sentence in a way that will be relevant. Of course, I'm taking it out of context. It's about racial justice mostly. But I do think that first, King is still right that this is what we are in dire need of today. And I also think that he's right in what he seems to imply about this lukewarm kind of liberalism that won't even defend its own side in an argument. That's a paraphrase of Prost, I think. Here's another metaphor. Ulrike already noted that there's more metaphors than usual here, but that will be true. Sometimes you get the impression that people who are not liberals, they play to win. And then the liberals come in and pretend they are the referee. So two things about this. First, well, if one team plays to win and the other pretends that they're the referee, who do you think is going to win? And the second point is about how inspiring it is. How many football fans do you know who root for the referee? So I do think that this confused kind of liberalism is also really problematic politically in the kind of way that these metaphors about football are supposed to show. Now, there's an interesting theoretical question in the background here, and that question is, what would we have done if the best, most intellectually defensible version of liberalism was politically weak? This becomes interesting. Maybe philosophers should stick to the truth, come what may. Maybe philosophers should change the world and not just interpret it. I don't know, that would have been a hard question. But if I'm right that we are in the, at least in one sense, fortunate position, that this tension does not arise. The dominant kind of liberalism that we've seen around us in the past decades is both intellectually indefensible and politically weak. Be that as it may, what I will have to say here will be on the intellectual side. I hope that it can also help politically, but that's a bit different. I guess it'll be more political than other things. It's a kind of a battle cry for what I think is the right way for a liberal political philosophy to go. I also have this in the written version, this I don't know that it's depressing, it's depressed kind of comment about how doing political philosophy now seems awkward no matter what you do, because everyone should, it's like a all hands on deck situation. Everybody should be doing the real stuff, not philosophizing about it. That may very well be right. If the megalomaniac hope is okay, then we're fine. I'm assuming that I'm not taking time that you otherwise would have used to mount a barricade. If it is, do that. All right, so I'm on number 2 on the handout. So when people talk about liberalism, they often, I mean, the point is often made that liberalism means very, very many different things for different people in different contexts. People often say that it means one thing in politics and quite another in political philosophy. And then they note that even just in politics, it means at least 2 different things on the 2 sides of the Atlantic. And there may be more ambiguities there too. So as I said, I'm not going to be doing history. It's not going to be about who captures better, whatever. Although I think that Mill is on my side. I'm on Mill's side. Yes. But I do want to at least make it reasonably clear what I will be talking about when I'm talking about liberalism. So very roughly, what I'm talking about is the kind of stuff that makes liberal democracy liberal, when in fact it is. That's the kind of liberalism I'm talking about. And this kind of liberalism is committed to a set of underlying sort of fundamentals, principles or values. And they may be vague, and there may be different interpretations of them and different ways of tying them together. And all of that's okay. I don't think that liberalism is the end of the conversation. But here they are, very roughly. One commitment is to personal individual liberty, in at least one important understanding as an important basic value. Another is to equality, although there are really many different conceptions. Maybe the right conception for liberalism is what is sometimes called basic equality, the sense, the somewhat mysterious sense, in which we are all each other's moral equals, despite being so different in so many ways, including in so many morally important ways. Maybe the relevant notion of equality is a kind of anti-hierarchical relationships kind of equality, maybe something else. But something deep, basic, and strong about equality is very much a part of what liberalism is all about. There's some commitment to individualism, though this is a commitment to individuals being the only thing that ultimately matters, not the only thing that matters. So as I understand liberalism, it is perfectly consistent. In fact, it mandates assigning a lot of significance to communities there, except that justifications end with individuals. So at the end of the day, communities are important if and when they are important, because they are important to individuals, or because they affect the welfare of individuals, or something along these lines. And liberalism comes with a commitment to personal autonomy, roughly to the thought that your life goes better, other things being equal, if you shape your life with your own choices, according to your own deep commitments. These are what I'll call the liberal fundamentals. There may be others, perhaps something about universalism is a part of the deal. Perhaps some rational hope, some hope in rationality, at least sort of methodologically, rather than as a substantive commitment. I'm not really sure. But this is what I'll be talking about. And in order to preempt misunderstanding, I also want to say what liberalism, as I understand it, is not about, or anyway is not about constitutively as a part of what the view is. It may be about these things by way of implications. So perhaps the first thing is that the most important thing is that liberalism is not about a specific system of government or a specific collective decision-making procedure. It may, at the end of the day, justify democracy. It may, at the end of the day, justify one person, one vote. Then again, it may not. It may justify a specific conception of democracy. Then again, it may not. But all of that is further down the line, and it is heavily sensitive to empirical contingent considerations. The fundamentals are not. Fundamentals are the starting points. They are not contingent. They are not empirically vulnerable. The move from liberalism to democracy, or perhaps to some conception of democracy, or perhaps to some other system of government, that is empirically vulnerable. That will depend on a lot of empirical considerations. So far, I said nothing about economics. Often when people when people criticize liberalism, certainly when they, well, in some circles, I guess, certainly when they criticize neoliberalism, what they have in mind is primarily some support for a capitalist market, which may very well be supported by these fundamentals or not, or most plausibly will be supported by these fundamentals in some circumstances, but not in others. The move from liberalism, from the liberal fundamentals to anything at all about, say, the market or capitalism is highly contingent and empirically vulnerable. Some people define liberalism by a commitment to state neutrality. The thought roughly that the state should not have a view on the question of the good life. I think, by the way, this is becoming less fashionable than it was to sort of think of liberalism in this way, but many people, certainly there are many influential texts that are still influential that do that, Waldron, Dworkin, I guess. Others, that's not ideal for one thing. It means that Mill is not a liberal, which one would think is less than ideal terminology. There's the whole discussion, neither is Raz. But anyway, for my money, state neutrality, that's a principle that is way further down the road compared to the fundamentals I started with. So if you're with me on the liberal fundamentals, we can then ask whether something about state neutrality follows. And if so, perhaps what more precisely, what kind of neutrality, in what circumstances, and so forth. And of course, George already mentioned that I'm not a huge fan of Rawls's political liberalism. So just to make sure, when I say liberalism, I do not mean political liberalism in that sense. It's a sad terminological accident that if you want to be a liberal when you do politics, you're already sort of committed to political liberalism, right? So I am committed. Maybe we can distinguish between small letter and big letter, right? I'm definitely committed to liberalism as a political position. So I guess I'm committed to political liberalism, small. I'm not committed to the book, capital P, capital L, or to the view. There will be more of this in what follows. And just like this, we can switch to the second page of the handout. With liberalism thus understood, somewhat vaguely, of course, but I hope you'll agree, not vacuous. Why should we accept this? Why should we accept the liberal fundamentals? And here I want to say that in one way we have very little to say, and in another we have almost too much to say. We have little to say because we are here in the context of defending ultimate value. At least possibly non-derivative values, though you may want to derive some of these from the others or whatever. And we know that we don't have a lot to say when it comes to ultimate values, right? We don't, I mean, if you just don't see it, it's not clear what more can be said. So I think that's partly true here. But we're not at a loss for words, even when we are talking about ultimate values, right? That's what we do often when we do ethics or sufficiently basic ethics. We see what follows from which suggested principle, and we come up with clever counterexamples. We revise the underlying principles or intuitions accordingly, and so on. In other words, the way to defend liberalism, especially if you're talking to someone who rejects these kinds of values, is to do ethics. The whole thing. Everything is in. Nothing is ruled out. It's sort of not relevant to politics. Certainly not at this stage. Now, you may be worried that you won't be able to convince the skeptic, in which case I think that you are right. You are unlikely to be able to convince the skeptic, but you are not right to worry over this. It's not a necessary requirement for the goodness of an argument that it be able to convince the skeptic. That's not true in epistemology in general, and it's not true here either. The fact that you won't be able to convince some people is extremely important politically, pragmatically. It poses a political danger, but it does not threaten either the truth of the theory or the insightfulness, goodness, soundness of the argument. Again, I'm not making some special discounts for political philosophy. I think that's true of any other part of philosophy as well, at least once we go sufficiently deep, as it were. A full discussion of what we of the rest of the stuff that I'll be talking about here. A full discussion of that will need the discussion, will need really a full moral philosophy. And it will need more. It will need also discussing the shortcomings of this kind of liberalism, responding to objections and so on. And it will require also evaluating alternative political philosophies, because at the end of the day, we choose the best theory around. And so that depends also on the holistic and comparative evaluation of all the theories out there. I won't do all of this here. It's not as if in order to devise a good battle cry, one has to first defeat one's enemies, right? So I want to agree that the full discussion of this will have to include the whole moral philosophy thing, but it's not as if nothing can be achieved without that. Right, so number 3 on the handout. And here I want to start with an example. So suppose that you live in a liberal state, where the general culture is by and large liberal, including sexual. But now suppose that you have a community within your liberal state, a community that is extremely sexually conservative, and that also has its own education system that generates people who deeply believe in this kind of hyper-conservative sexual morality, inculcates this kind of stuff. You can, I mean, maybe it's a fairly extreme religious community, yes, as are these cases in my country, and I think not only there. And the question is, what kind of attitude you as a liberal, or you as the liberal state, should have towards that system of education in that community? And the even more painful question is, and what, if anything, should you do about it? So what should you do about it is extremely hard in ways that I will return to, but I want to first distinguish between 2 attitudes of going about answering these questions. Yeah? Here's one. You start from respect. They're your fellow citizens. They have very different conceptions of the good. They merit respect. There is disagreement about this kind of conception of the good. This disagreement is pretty much the starting point for political philosophy. By and large, there may be exceptions, but by and large, the state should not take a stand on these questions. This may be because of some metaphysical doubts. So you may think that there is no truth of the matter as to whether, as to which kind of sexual morality is right. Or you may be skeptical in a more epistemological way, right? So you may think that maybe there's a truth of the matter, but we can't know it, or we can't be sufficiently confident, sufficiently justifiably confident. Or maybe you go for some kind of relativism, according to which whether or not that's the right way to go depends on the question for whom, in some sense. So that for us, this is the right sexual morality, but for them, that's the right sexual morality, something along these lines. Or perhaps you go for a very, very broad kind of pluralism, so that very different conceptions of sexuality are all good in different ways, perhaps. Maybe they're all equally good. Maybe they're just incommensurably good. Something along these lines. Maybe you think that even if you reject all the things that I just said, for some other reason, for the state to have a view on sexual morality in the face of such disagreement is somehow not suitable for politics. And there may be other things you can think too. So that's one kind of attitude, and I hope you recognize it from the air. It's everywhere. And while I did attempt to present it in a respectable way, I hope you won't be surprised to learn that I don't think that's the way to go. Here's the alternative. You start from uncompromising insistence on the value of personal autonomy, including sexual autonomy. You think that the effects of such an educational system on sexual alienation, on sexual autonomy, therefore on autonomy more generally, in no likelihood on well-being, on suffering, these effects are tragic. And you are not afraid to recognize all of that. Nothing about skepticism convinces you. I mean, sure, we should be epistemically modest in some context, but no, I know that. I know that that's wrong. relativism is ridiculously false if coherent at all, here as everywhere else. Pluralism may yet be true, but if it is true, it is a much narrower kind of pluralism. So it's not the everything goes kind of pluralism. There may be draw at the top between conceptions of the good and ways of life. There may be incommensurabilities at the top. But that shouldn't confuse you for one moment that many of those are much better than many of the things that are not at the top. As, for instance, is the way of life we're talking about here. And furthermore, all of the stuff that I just said is totally fair game for politics. Nothing is in principle excluded. But of course, if the question is what should we do politically, then there are many other considerations that are relevant. It's not enough to just insist on the value of autonomy, sexual autonomy, well-being, whatever it is that does work there. What should we do should be sensitive to many other considerations. Some of them, many of them are pragmatic, instrumental ones. It's quite possible that this is a horrible tragedy, but that any realistic attempt by the state to intervene will be more tragic still. That's a possibility, and we need to be very careful about that. The history of such interventions does not typically spell good news here. And there may be other considerations too, not purely pragmatic, not purely instrumental, more perhaps in some sense more principled considerations that are especially important for the liberal. So you may think, for instance, that if you are a liberal, you take personal autonomy seriously. If you take personal autonomy seriously, you care deeply about the personal autonomy of the children whose sexual autonomy is being deprived of them by the system. But on the other hand, you also care about the personal autonomy of the parents. The common metaphor is that you want to let people tell their own life story or be the part authors of their life story. Well, you don't really let me tell my own life story unless you allow me a serious influence on my children's life stories, because life stories are intertwined in all sorts of ways. So the consideration of personal autonomy may, there are many more things to say here, but may cut both ways. And the liberal, especially the liberal, has to be sensitive to that as well. Similarly, you may think, everything here is controversial, but still, you may think that taking personal autonomy seriously will sometimes require to take at least somewhat seriously also the autonomy of communities. Not because communities ultimately matter, they don't, you are at bottom an individualist. But because the ability of individuals to be part authors of the life story is partly determined by their membership of communities that are at least partly self-authoring their communal stories. So at the end of the day, I mean, after having considered all of the complications, practical and otherwise, it's not clear what someone who takes the second attitude in this community will end up recommending by way of policy. It's even possible that they'll end up recommending the very same policies that the first one would. Then again, it's possible that may not. That will depend on the many, many contingencies that are relevant there. But even if they end up converging on the kind of policy that they recommend, at least the second attitude does not deny the tragedy and does not lose its confidence in the liberal fundamentals. So I think it's really important, even if you can't do anything about it, to at least recognize that this is a horrible tragedy. You just know that any attempt at intervention will, blood will be shed in horrendous quantity. So maybe you shouldn't do it. But that is still a tragedy. Notice how different the role of disagreement is according to these two attitudes. According to the first attitude, disagreement is pretty much the starting point. It defines the problem. According to the second, disagreement is still extremely important politically, but it's important as an implementation problem. You start with the liberal fundamentals and you don't lose your sight of them. And then when you come to the real world, you open your eyes to all of the practical complexities, including those having to do with disagreement. Perhaps disagreement is an especially important implementation problem, although I'm not sure about that either, because there are many implementation problems. But that's all it is. The second response, my response, can be seen as shameless in both directions. When it comes to fundamentals, it is confident in the liberal fundamentals, unshakingly confident in them, uncompromising about them, not even a tiny little bit. Nothing about disagreements should in any way change that. I mean, we can talk about the epistemology of peer disagreement some other day. Politically, the disagreement shows that this community is in trouble. It doesn't show that the liberal fundamentals are. That's sort of one kind of shamelessly confident. But the other side is that when it comes to politics, there is no limit to what this kind of liberal is in principle willing to compromise on. Because when it comes to politics, we are trying to get the best possible solution in a practically complicated situation. In fact, maybe we're not even trying to do that. Maybe what we are trying to do is to avoid the worst solution. Maybe that's enough. So the kind of liberalism I advocate is shamelessly pragmatism on the practical side, while being fully confident on the more intellectual side, or the deeper moral side. I want to note that this kind of pragmatism on the practical side is not something that this liberal should be embarrassed about. I think that liberalism should be entirely unapologetic about this pragmatism as well. There's a holy duty to compromise, even on horrible things, when it is the best you can do, and what is the best you can do is dictated by the liberal fundamentals we started with. So, for instance, this reflects on the whole discussion of a modus vivendi. You know, Rawls like to say that his kind of stuff was supposed to show that it's not a mere modus vivendi, right? The kind of consensus he was going for. And Williams, I think, took all the wind out of that stuff ages ago, when I think in a footnote he says something like, "What I don't see what is mere about modus vivendi," and I think that's fully correct. It doesn't leave a lot to say. But if you're not sure, here's a nice quote that I came across from Anthony Appiah. The romantic state could pride itself on being it's also at the bottom of page 2 on the handout. The romantic state could pride itself on being the emanation of the folk and its primordial consciousness. The liberal state has to get by with a goody less mystical mumbo jumbo. The romantic state could boldly identify itself with a general will. Liberal states must content themselves with a general willingness. The romantic state rallies its citizens with a stirring cry, one people. The liberal state's true anthem is, "We can work it out." But I think that "we can work it out" can be extremely inspiring if done right. Done right, namely, not as the starting point, but as what is sometimes dictated by the liberal fundamentals. So the commitment to modus vivendi is not, as I think sometimes by Rawls is not on the opposite side of some principles. It's one's principles that require, the true principles, the liberal principles, require a limitless willing to go for a modus vivendi, at least often, or to compromise on other things. This liberal does not pretend that they're the referee. They're a fully committed team. But also, and here the metaphor ceases to be of value, if there ever was. But this team is committed. Its own commitments are such that they restrict what the liberal can do in trying to win the game. For instance, the stuff about the significance of autonomy of others of others as well. I think that this kind of liberalism is theoretically ambitious, but practically modest. And it's theoretically ambitious because it opts for the full truth of morality that are relevant politically. It's practically modest because it understands, indeed, it mandates understanding the constraints of the use of power, the constraints of what can and cannot be plausibly done in a state of the kinds that we have around us. It's theoretically maximalist because it knows what it wants, not an overlapping consensus or any of this stuff. What it wants is the whole thing, a full manifestation of the liberal fundamentals. But it is politically minimalist because it understands the dangers and is willing to compromise on everything. So here my hero is, to an extent, Judith Shklar and her work on the liberalism of fear. Now, there's a lot in her stuff that I reject. For instance, in other texts, she's very big on some weird kind of skepticism. Well, I'm less impressed with her as a metaethicist than as a political philosopher, political theorist. I fully take from her the kind of pessimist starting point. So she's famous for saying, you know, we shouldn't pursue summum bonum. We should settle for summum malum and avoid that. Forget about the highest good. Let's talk about the highest evil and just avoid that. That, I think, is a very good starting point. Sorry, not very good starting point. A very good point. It's a very good, for her, it may be a starting point, I'm not sure. For me, that's what you should focus on when you're doing politics, follows from the liberal fundamentals. So it's not a starting point. I also disagree with her about what the summum malum is, and in footnote 1 on the handout, I forgot to write the name of my paper. It's called Politics and Suffering, where I explain why I think that she's right on the pessimism, but wrong on the summum malum. So for her, it's cruelty and fear, and I think that that's way too patient-based. Sorry, way too agent-based. I think that we should focus on serious suffering on the patient side, not on the agent side. But that's a matter for another day. Okay, so I hope now you have a kind of picture of the liberalism that I think we should go for, and also some of its advantages. And the rest of what I have to say will really be just some implications of this. So now it's also a good question to ask, how much more time do I have?
You have 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. So I may, yeah, I'll be quicker on some than on others. Okay, so George already mentioned the stuff about Rawls's political liberalism. I should say that I'm not sure I agree with everything George said. I'm not sure that Rawlsian political philosophy is inconsistent with the kind of metaethical view that I defend. But that is a matter for another occasion, except for one thing that I'll say here. I think that the tone is very different, right? That's precisely the difference between the two attitudes that I suggested about the socially conservative community and its education system. Also, there's the difference about the role of disagreement. So clearly for Rawls, at least in political liberalism, disagreement, or maybe reasonable disagreement, is very much a part of the defining problem for political philosophy, which I just don't buy at all. It is an implementation problem further down the road. So that's an important difference. Another one also related to some of the things that George already mentioned is the position of the political philosopher, which according to Rawls sure feels like is the kind of, I mean, probably the political philosopher is entitled to a comprehensive doctrine like anyone else, but that's, you know, back home or in their church or something. But when you do political philosophy, you're just, right. So I don't buy that at all. And elsewhere, I argue in detail against this kind of view. If even one of my criticisms there, and these pieces are, especially the first one against public reason, is partly summarizes and develops objections that have been in the literature from the get-go. But if at least one of these objections succeed, then political liberalism in the Rawlsian way fails. And then if you're into liberalism, you have to find some alternative. It still doesn't mean that mine is the one to go, but it at least raises the chances of that. I do want to make two somewhat concessive points here. One is that there's at least one way of understanding the underlying intuition, or perhaps one underlying intuition of Rawls's political liberalism, that I can accommodate to an extent within the kind of shameless liberalism that I favor. The sort of characteristic principle of political liberalism is that a system of government, or perhaps a constitutional essential, or perhaps a government policy, is not legitimate unless it can be justified to each and every of those under it, or anyway, each and every one of the reasonable people who are under it, or something along these lines. So I don't accept this as a necessary condition for legitimacy at all. But I can accommodate at least some of this. So you may think that it follows from the right conception of autonomy, saying that it always counts against a political arrangement if it is not justifiable to, in a way that's accessible in some way, to some of the people whom it governs. That falls short of justifying the necessary condition for legitimacy, which is great because that necessary condition for legitimacy fails on other grounds. But at least it's a way of accommodating this underlying intuition. So this is good. The other point, and this is where I'm not sure that I agree with what George said earlier. I'm not entirely sure that Rawls does reject or has to reject shameless liberalism. So Rawls famously restricts the requirement of justifiability to, it only applies to the reasonable. So if you are reasonable, or if your comprehensive doctrine is reasonable, and yet some constitutional essential cannot be justified to you, then it's illegitimate. But if you are unreasonable, and the constitutional essential is not justifiable to you, then Rawls remains indifferent. This does not undermine legitimacy on the kind of roles in religion. Now, it's a good question how to understand reasonableness, what it entails. But at least according to one central way of understanding it, you cannot be reasonable unless you are, broadly speaking, a liberal. According to many influential understanding, you can't count as reasonable unless you are a Rawlsian. Wong says that, Esland says that, Gauss, I think, says that. But even if that's too much, you have to be a liberal. I mean, so Kwong, for instance, understand the whole Rawlsian project as an internal liberal project. The attempt is just within the liberals to reach some conclusions. I don't do history of philosophy, and I have zero interest in Rawls exegesis. But if that's the right way of reading Rawls, then now we can ask, okay, what does Rawls think about this agreement about liberal fundamentals with the unreasonable? The mere fact that he likes to play the referee among the liberals doesn't yet say anything about what he thinks about that. So it's possible that actually when it comes to that, Rawls is a shameless liberal. And if you're looking, outside the seminar room in the world, then the vast majority of disagreements are disagreements with people who are not reasonable in any plausible Rawlsian sense. So depending on what's the right understanding of reasonable and what Rawls thinks about disagreeing with the unreasonable, about which I don't think he says much, maybe at the end of the day, this is what he should endorse. Maybe it's what he does endorse. If this is so, then this will be yet another case in which, Rawls is, though bad, much better than many Rawlsians. That shouldn't surprise us, right? True for Marx and Marxists, for Hegel and Hegelians, I'm sure, and for many others as well. Right. Toleration. Again, I think there are two ways of going about toleration. One is to start with maybe skepticism or relativism or something along these lines, perhaps extending the principle of toleration to philosophy itself. This is an almost quote from Rawls. You already know what I think about that. That doesn't mean that toleration is not important. You start without skepticism, without relativism, with full uncompromising commitment to the liberal fundamentals. But then there are pragmatic complexities. There are also interesting epistemic complexities, by the way. So often, it's very hard to know what the implications within a community will be for some intervention. Or often there is phenomenological ignorance. You don't know what it's like to wear a burqa, say, right? So you should be pragmatically modest, and you should be epistemically modest. And perhaps you should also respect the autonomy of some people who are not liberals. And this will dictate further constraints. So toleration may very well be justified, but if it's justified, it's not justified by the confused relativist or skeptic or Rawlsian kind of way, but because that is what is called for based on the liberal fundamentals, given some contingent complexities that you find yourself in. Of course, it's also possible that sometimes toleration will not be justified in such cases, which is okay. Many years ago, Popper wrote about this stuff, and I think he usually summarizes things, you shouldn't tolerate those who are not themselves tolerating. That seems like a point in the right direction, but if I'm right, there is nothing that guarantees that the solution is going to be that neat, like neatly packaged in one sentence. No, it's going to really depend on all of the pragmatic, epistemic, and other complications. There's a big divide between doing ideal and doing non-ideal theory. I think people are starting to get a little bit less excited about this. It was a very big deal for a while. So roughly, very roughly, you do ideal theory if you seek the principles, say, for a political system, assuming that once you have found those principles, they will be fully complied with. Or in some other ways, introducing some idealizing assumptions. You're doing non-ideal theory if you're trying to find the principles for roughly the kind of people and communities that you are, we have empirical evidence that it's likely that you will actually face. And there's a whole discussion. Rawls famously thought that there should be some priority for ideal theory. Liberalism thus understood, is it a part of ideal theory or a part of non-ideal theory? So I think that you can do either ideal theory or non-ideal theory with Shameless liberalism. You can ask. The difference for me is the difference between two kinds of questions. And once you see that, the whole discussion becomes less exciting because we're not in the business of legislating for people what questions they're going to address, right? That's a good question and that's a good question. But I think you see where my heart lies. So I think that while it's perfectly fine if you as a political philosopher do ideal theory, I mean, it's perfectly fine if you do analytic metaphysics, right? It's roughly, I think, as closely related to the real world. And that's okay too. But it's also perfectly fine to do non-ideal theory. And then you need to be really sensitive to the facts. And while it's perfectly fine if you do ideal theory, I think if you find out that the field does ideal theory, as is sometimes presupposed, that's what that's not just what you want to do because that's what you're interested in, that's fine. That's what political philosophers ought to do. That I think is terrible. We certainly should not look down upon doing non-ideal theory. Maybe one more point. Is that okay? Yeah, I think I'll settle just for the PowerPoint. Okay, it's not. Oh no, I have to say something about democracy. So two more points. Sometimes people who like to call themselves political realists, they have nothing to do with the kind of moral realism that I like. They sometimes accuse liberals, what they call political moralists, of not having enough room for power in their theories. I think the thought is roughly something like, look, ethics is not about power. Politics is about power. So this puts a very low upper bound on how relevant ethics can be to politics. And so these people will often talk about politics having its own sui generis kind of normativity that is not reducible to morality and perhaps also that is not continuous with morality. So I think that none of this stuff works. I think that the talk of political normativity is just nonsensical throughout, and I think that this point has been made in the literature by now more than once, fully convincingly. But I also want to note that there's kind of sentiment about which they're right. I think they're right that often liberals have not paid enough attention to power. And the fix for that is not to desert liberalism, is to improve liberalism in a way that does take power into account. As I said, not in the fundamental stage, but in the pragmatic stage later on. In fact, I think that once you see it this way, you see that they were wrong all along about ethics as well. I think power is extremely important, even for interpersonal morality. So yes, power is extremely relevant to politics, not at the fundamental stage, but still. That doesn't show that morality is irrelevant, because power is extremely important to interpersonal morality as well. And if we moral theorists have neglected that, then that is a problem. But the way to fix it is not to introduce another confusion about politics. Okay, last point for now about democracy. So I like this quote from Shklar that many people quote. Liberalism is monogamously, faithfully, and permanently married to democracy, but it is a marriage of convenience. Again, more than one way of understanding it, and I don't do exegesis, but at least one right thing to say here is that if democracy is justified, that is a somewhat contingent implication of the liberal fundamentals. Certainly for one person, one vote, if you can justify that, that will be because it follows from the liberal fundamentals, perhaps to a specific set of circumstances. The thing that is uncompromised, that you should be uncompromising about, is the liberal fundamentals. Democracy is already about realistic implementation and what kind of shape democracy should take, or whether we even should be Democrats, is further down the road. Mill gets a lot of bad rep for these paragraphs where he talks about, I think, some nations being unfit for self-government. That's probably with justification that he's criticized for it. But we should be open-minded, especially seeing what we see today, for instance, that maybe he wasn't ambitious enough. It's quite possible that no nation is fit for self-government, or anyway, for the kind of self-government that we see today, how fragile it is, or how inviting to hostile takeovers, or something along these lines. All of this is matter for really hard, contingent, I guess, kind of political science. But all of this should be motivated by the uncompromising liberal fundamentals. We already have some of the empirical science. So Brennan, for instance, and others like to point out some of the shortcomings of an electoral system, for instance. They are shockingly bad. On the other hand, you may think, I think Cristiano likes to point out that still democracies, or by and large democracies, have a much better human rights record than many others. They have a poor human rights record, but it's still much better than others. Amartya Sen liked to know that there was never a major famine in a democracy. These are, I don't know enough about the empirical stuff, but these are precisely the kind of considerations that are relevant to the justification of democracy. All of this with a liberal fundamentalism in mind. There's one complication. Sometimes, often, a derivative value achieves a local kind of independence from the value that it's grounded on. We can talk about it more if you want. It's possible that while democracy is at the end of the day justified by reference to the liberal fundamentals, still within some context it achieves the kind of independence that means that we should support it even when there's already a kind of discontinuity with those liberal values. So this may enter this one further complication. Okay, this was too long, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Now the queue is open for questions. If I can please ask you to say your name and affiliation before you ask your question. Julika.
Yeah, I'm Ulrika. I'm philosophy department, like you said. David, you were talking a lot about fundamentals, but to my ear, a lot of what you said was a bit vacuous.
Was what, sorry?
Was a bit vacuous, empty. I mean, when you, for instance, looked at this confrontation of the conservative community and liberal refuse to settle autonomy, At least with the conservative community, I think they would probably have some idea of what's good about sexual intercourse and one's life. What does your liberal appealing to sexual autonomy say about that? Now, I imagine as soon as they say anything, the fundamental begins to crumble into disagreement, right? It's certainly not for everybody what they say. And so to even see that this is a barrier, seems to me.
You said it begins crumbling into disagreement. I think it's definitely into disagreement. And I urge you not to view that as crumbling. Everything of value is controversial. That's a part of the point. Disagreement does not define the problem. It is often a political problem. It is not a theoretical problem, or anyway, not as deep and central a theoretical problem. Of course, they will have things to say. Some of them may be interesting. Some of them may sound convincing. We also know that they will all be false, because we know that this kind of oppressive sexual education cannot be justified. And we shouldn't lose our confidence just because some people, including some smart people, are on the other side. That's precisely part of the point. Here's a nice example. None of them will lose their confidence just because some of the smart people are on our side.
What is on our side? What does our side say?
So,
Other than just offering a label.
well, I only offered the label here. I have a lot more to say about autonomy. I've even said quite a bit about autonomy. And certainly liberalism can have a lot more to say. As I said, for instance, about equality. It's a really big question how to best understand it. Is it about basic equality? If it's about basic equality, how best to understand basic equality? If it's about, I don't know, some non-domination or against hierarchies or against hierarchies of a certain kind, we should talk about that and fill in the details of that. I'm not saying that this somewhat programmatic paper has all the answers. We need to do ethics. That's the point. But armed with that, and let's talk about well-being, and let's talk about sexual pleasure, and let's talk about sexual autonomy. Let's talk about the relation between autonomy and power structures. And let's talk about all of these things. You have to do all of that. I don't think you have to do all of that in order to know that deeply oppressive education systems are wrong. But if you want the full stuff, then that's what you'll have to include. Yeah.
Joe is next. Joe.
Thank you. Joe Ward, Oxford, once upon a time here, or nearby. Going on some of the lines, I mean, not the same question. The distinction between fundamental and derivative or pragmatic is very important to me. Right? I mean, a number of questions you can ask about that. One is, how important is it really in the end? But if you think about the case of the conservative community, you said if we try to implement shameless liberalism, then that could be a disaster. And I think you gave two types of reasons why it could be a disaster. One is that it could conflict with the fundamentals. So there, it just looks like the fundamental principles are conflicting with themselves. That's not a conflict with something else. Or pragmatic instrumental reasons, but you didn't tell us what they were. So there might be a principle like harm reduction. And so if often you hear this, if you do the right thing, it's going to lead to lots of harm. Maybe people won't obey the law. So you hear this about abortion, for example. So some people who are opposed to abortion don't think it should be illegal because they think it would be worse to have. The consequences will be worse if it was illegal. But that sounds like another fundamental principle, one of harm reduction. So in the end, I'm wondering whether you can really make that distinction between fundamental principles and the pragmatic considerations that somehow limit them.
Thank you. Right. So a few things. You say what will be the nature of the disaster? and you mentioned possibility of a conflict with the liberal fundamentals. So I think the word conflict here is dangerously ambiguous. It may be understood as a kind of contradiction, which is devastating for a theory. And as you might expect, I don't think that's what's going on here. It may be a kind of practical tension, the kind of tension that I face whenever I need to decide whether I'm having dessert or not. So I'm committed to my health. I also really like sweet stuff. That doesn't show that there's some deep contradiction. It just shows that more than one thing is of value, and sometimes they push in opposite directions, right? That I think is going to happen here too. So it's quite possible that in many cases, you're going to have this kind of conflict, namely the tension within the liberal values, which is not a problem for a theory. I'm right to both value tasty desserts and my health, right? So I think that's the kind of stuff that will be going on here. I think you're right. This is a little embarrassing, but still, I was going to say, maybe I should include something about well-being in the fundamentals. I think I wasn't, because I was taking it for granted, and I think that that's probably something that's, without the other things, is in no way unique to liberalism. But still, it should be there, because clearly it's one of the things. Of course, it should be there. In fact, in this paper, partly on Shklar, on politics and suffering, I say that for many political purposes, we should just focus on minimizing serious suffering more than other things. So I fully agree with this. I want to take advantage of your point in order to explain what I hinted at, how I disagree with the last part of the quote from Martin Luther King. He says, enough with this. This is too quickly. Let's do things more slowly. I think that sometimes that's precisely the way to do politics, because I'm deeply afraid of backlashes, and so that's precisely the kind of things where I would think this is a horrible compromise that may nonetheless be justified.
So if I go back to what you said first of all about the inner case, having deserved these principles. So I think the way I would understand that is not saying there's a conflict between principles and pragmatic considerations. I would say the principles are just indeterminate in what they lead to.
I may have misspoken. I don't think there's a conflict between principles and pragmatic. I think pragmatic considerations are dictated within bounds by the principles. And I agree that often the principles will not determine a single answer. At least before a lot of the work that Ulrike wanted me to do is done. So before we feel, fully specify the relevant conception of autonomy and the relevant conception of equality and so on. But it's quite possible that even then there will be some indeterminacy left, and that's okay.
Mark.
My question sort of dovetails or builds on to what you were saying. I'm wondering whether when we talk about two ways in which you want to be shameless, whether the pragmatic willingness to be concessive might require us, in fact, to project the image that we have been, the shameful kind of liberals at the theoretical point. There's no point calling Trump over here and then saying, "Oh, we hate you, but we'll have to do business with you," because that's not going to cut it. So we're going to have to act as if we are theoretical liberals as well. And it's, if we do really converge in that sense, then all we're left with is getting to exactly the same point, plus what you describe as the tragedy that we should not deny. So we just added on tragedy. So why should we do that?
Things are depressing enough. So I definitely want to consider the first point. I sometimes think William spoke about government house utilitarianism, right? That's kind of utilitarianism for us. But of course, we're going to tell the masses some other story that's more nicely believable or whatever. I am open to the possibility of government house shameless liberalism. Of course I am. You know that I am, because whether we should say it or not is a complicated, pragmatic political question. And I'm open to the thought that otherwise being equal, we should be sincere, but otherwise, I don't know that other things are equal, and it's complicated. So I'm definitely with you on that. Does that mean that all I'm adding is yet another depressing thought? I don't think so. What would be needed for that is that we knew a priori that everywhere and always it will be, all things considered, better to keep this kind of shameless liberalism quiet. And furthermore, that there is something else we can say that's going to have better results. I don't see that we are in that position at all. I don't know how much influence philosophy has anyway, but to the extent that it does, all of the political philosophers have been singing throughout the last 40 years, this rolls in bullshit. That got us a lot of good, right? So we should be open-minded to the thought that maybe we should sing other songs. I know that that was a touch too much. But I don't think it's not.
Andrea.
So thanks. In a way, I found this a bit frustratingly indeterminate. So I'm with you. I love the shamelessness and the rest of it, but the devil's in the details. So I was just wondering, one thing that puzzled me was on the fundamentals, right? So you list these core principles or values, rather. I'm curious what the relationships are. So why shouldn't we think that some of them are reducible to the others? What is a lot of this story going to be about how they're actually independent? Like even the anti-hierarchy stuff you're saying, well, if you don't rely on some notion of moral equality to state a view about anti-hierarchy, you're likely going to be drawing on things like autonomy or liberty. Indeed, that's the whole point of non-domination. So I worry about how these things really fit together. Now you say, oh yeah, there are different conceptions, but that's what I mean by it's frustratingly indeterminate. Like I need a bit more. Why exactly these four? How are they independent? Did they reduce? Why not? Are they lexically worded? Blah, 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 blah.
All good questions. So here's the really annoying answer. All good questions, not the project of this paper. Somewhat less annoying answer, but still annoying. About some of these, I have a lot to say and have said in print. About others, I have some to say and hope to say soon. For the purposes of this paper, I don't need, for instance, an answer to the question about, I'm going to put it in the way that's worst for me, about fundamentality of the fundamentals, right? So I'm open to the thought. I just spoke to someone, a colleague from Tel Aviv, who thinks that everything is reducible to autonomy, properly understood. I find it hard to believe, but I'm willing to see. If you can get liberty for free out of the full understanding of autonomy, that's okay with me. Right? So despite calling them the liberal fundamentals, and maybe there's a sense in which that's not the best term, I'm not committed to them being all non-derivative, entirely independent of each other as well. I am committed to all of them they're being fundamentals in the sense of going back to basics when you do politics, right? Not in the sense of irreducibility. But I share your desire to see more here, and I hope to do something to satisfy it in the future.
Robert.
Thanks. I'm Rob Simpson from UCL Philosophy. Yeah, I like this a lot. But the thing that I think I'm most worried about at this stage is how you defend the way you position disagreement in the theoretical project. But the kind of liberalism you're criticizing takes disagreement as kind of defining the problem to which a liberal theory of justice is the answer. They're saying that's not what we should do. We should treat it as this downstream implementation thing. I was unclear what the argument was meant to be for that, or whether that was just brute, or whether, does that sort of fall out of some other part of the picture, or
It falls out of taking the fundamentals seriously. So
it falls out of taking the fundamentals seriously.
yeah, because if you think that the most important things that should guide us when we do politics are things like liberty, autonomy, individualism, equality, then nothing about disagreement has so far been said at all.
Do you think in something like the people who put disagreement at the center of their method or inquiry, you've got this other value, maybe it's respect or something like that, for things like respect. So they've added this other thing into the mix, which is not actually a part of the liberal fundamentals properly construed, and consequently that's led them to put disagreement in the wrong place in the kind of theoretical process.
I'm not trying the best person to do a kind of postmortem of that stuff. Maybe your description is correct. Maybe they are just terribly confused by skeptical silliness or by some kind of relativism. Maybe they feel, this thing is actually very, I mean, I don't know what your experience is, but my experience when you talk to students about these things, it seems clear, maybe this is changing now, who the hell knows. It seems clear that the kind of motivation that makes them embarrassed about, say, asserting liberal fundamentals is, worries either the confused kind of relativism or worries about Western imperialism, right? Okay, so we should talk about this, and I'm sure that motivates at least some theorists as well. I don't know what best explains this stuff. It's possible that some of them will sign on to my list and will just say that what follows from it is, and then something really important about disagreement. I'm sorry?
When those people who see disagreement as falling out of the fundamentals that you yourself.
This will depend on.
What's the mistake there?
Different people make different mistakes, but they all make mistakes. And this will depend on the details of their argument, right? So you mentioned respect, for instance. This is really interesting. Respect may be understood as a further fundamental, or it may be understood as perhaps the best understanding of one of these things or their combined effect. It's a really interesting question. How does one respect a person who holds on to morally problematic views? Raz says somewhere that the way you respect them is by engaging them, not by sort of abstracting away from the disagreement. Rawls's view seems to be, at least as long as they're reasonable, very, very different. I'm closer to Raz, but I don't think, I think that respect calls for different things in different cases. But sometimes it calls for engaging, and sometimes it calls for abstracting away from disagreement, and sometimes there are other things, but we need to see about that. Rawls's stuff about the disagreement proceeds, among other things, through this stuff about the burdens of judgment, which is another way of saying, I really don't know my epistemology, which was already terrible in the 80s, but it's even worse now that they continue to do it as if there's nothing going on in epistemology. So there are going to be different mistakes there. But again, at the very least, if disagreement is relevant, it is relevant derivatively. And maybe some of them will sign on to that, but some of them will not. I just recently had a look at McCabe's book, Modus Vivendi Liberalism. And just because of the title, I was looking forward to read The Kindred Spirit. And then I found out that it was not, because it's extremely Rawlsian. It's Rawlsian with a vengeance, because he thinks that what defines the problem is disagreement, including with the unreasonable ones. So it's even worse in this respect. Yeah, but this will depend on the detail.
Jeff.
Jeff Howard, UCL Political Science. Thanks, David. Just a question about the fundamentals. So in your gloss of personal autonomy, you said your life goes better when you shape your life by your own choices. That was your, it's on the handout, that was your verbal gloss on it. And I thought that the fundamentals weren't supposed to be empirically contingent, but that strikes me as empirically contingent. So I was wondering why you opted for that welfarist or perfectionist framing or rationale for personal autonomy rather than something along the lines of people are entitled to make their own choices.
Why do you think that it's empirically?
They have a right to make their own choices rather than it being this alternative.
Okay, so when I say that people's lives go better if they're autonomous, I don't mean other things in their lives go better, or I don't mean that all things concerned. I mean that the very fact that they shape their lives already constitutively, not causally, constitutively makes their life go better. So if you hold everything else equal, but you took a part in shaping your life in this way and I did not, then in this respect, your life goes better. So it's not supposed to be empirical at all.
Right. Okay.
I don't think it's about just making just having the right to make your own choice. That is too narrow. I think in other papers, I distinguish between autonomy understood as sovereignty and understood as non-alienation. So autonomy understood as sovereignty is roughly making the call, having the last word on some matter. Autonomy as understood as non-alienation is about a harmony between how your life goes and your deep commitments and values. And often I think that these two come together, but not always. And I think that both of them are indispensable to doing ethics and especially political philosophy. And there are also interesting relations between them. So I think that's too narrow anyway. But yes, the kind of autonomy I'm talking about here is empirically non-boundary. Yeah.
Sure.
Just quickly, the other thing I wanted to pick you up on had to do with your claim that the commitment to the team dictates constraints on how to pursue victory.
Right.
And I just wanted to invite you to say more about that, because I take it that a lot of people who want to defend democracy see it precisely as a constraint on how we should set out to achieve liberal aims. But could you just say more about what kind of constraints you have in mind?
So I am the priests of the religion of autonomy should accept the significance of the autonomy also of the infidels. That restricts, I mean, there's a very long tradition of what priests of all sorts of religions can do to those who disagree, right? But you certainly think that their well-being matters. The mere fact that they are not liberals does not change that. And you also think that their autonomy matters. And that places constraints on how you can intervene, because whenever you intervene, even if you do it in order to further the one true political philosophy, there is always a price in autonomy, which you yourself, as a good liberal, see as a price. Right? So your own liberalism both requires advance in certain directions, but also places constraints on what you can do as you pursue these. Does this help?
So just to clarify, so the autonomy of the oppressor in the example of the community that sexually oppresses members is compromised if the liberal state takes action to impede them.
Yes, although I would not describe it in this way. I mean, de re, it's the autonomy of the oppressor. But de dicto, that's not what matters. What matters is that typically, even forms of life that are deeply oppressive in all sorts of ways also have value, right? They can manifest other values, right? And typically, an intervention in that kind of stuff will also unsettle the ways in which these forms of life or these communities supply value. And typically, here's the thing that I hate most about this. If I tell the ultra-Orthodox in my country, of course you can tell your own life stories, all of that's fine. Just one really minor thing. When it comes to sex education in your classroom, I'm dictating the content. Maybe all things considered, that should be done, although it will have to be done with armies. But you can't seriously say, but I fully respect your ability to tell your own life story. Because if I teach your children sexual education and you come from this hyper-sexually conservative whatever, then this seriously harms your ability to author your life. That's the way in which the commitment to autonomy may restrict that. So I'm not saying that what is of value here is your freedom to sexually oppress your young. That's why I said I wouldn't say it in this way. What's of value here is all sorts of other things that the community supplies and the ability to be a part author of your life.
It just seems that the idea of autonomy figures in different ways when you talk about the victim and the oppressor. It seems to figure constitutively for the victim, not constitutively for the oppressor, whereby the cost on autonomy is instrumental or consequential, whereas for the cost to the autonomy of the victim is just intra facto, the fact that they denied the choice.
I see. It may not, I don't think it's necessarily instrumental for the parents, say. It may be derivative or non-ultimate. That's true. But so what? It's not as if underived values always get priority over derived.
Kevin.
So I can't go detail. So I want to get a better sense of your difference with Rawls and liberalism. And so I'm looking at the top of page 3 of your handout. And you say your kind of liberalism is theoretically ambitious or practically modern. So you were thinking of Rawlsian liberalism as theoretically modest, wrapped by relativism or skepticism or something like that. Now, in doing comprehensive theory, Rawlsian can be as ambitious theoretically as you are. So perhaps what he's doing is locating political philosophy in the practical side. I'm just pushing a particular interpretation of what Rawls is doing to see the difference. Whereas you put political philosophy in the theoretical side. It's just that you seem to think the practical area is mostly empirical, contingent matters, whereas Rawls thinks that there are more structural matters that we can theorize about. Would that be a fair description of the difference?
I'm sorry, I got confused towards that. So I thought you said initially that maybe he puts political philosophy on the political side and I do on the theoretical side.
Yeah.
But then towards the end, you said that I think that he thinks there are more structural constraints on
Structural constraints in reaching some kind of political legitimacy.
I see. So you think that his project is really armchair political science?
Well, perhaps there are some considerations that are susceptible to armchair theorizing.
Okay, so first, I don't think this is how he's often read, although maybe sometimes, who knows. And second, it's embarrassingly weak armchair political science. If you take him to be saying anything about the real, I mean, and he protects himself for that, doing ideal theory, right? So I don't see how you can reconcile this with the talk about ideal theory, and certainly with what many Rawlsians say, as if they've never been outside of the department. So sure, that would be a good project. If someone wants to do that and also call themselves a Rawlsian, all the power to.
But things like when you're thinking about legitimacy, about stability of government and control, that's the kind of thing that could be political science. I'm sure political science, but still political science.
If you're saying that there's stuff in the book that is careless about the distinction between the a priori and the empirical, I will agree.
Right. So we have many people waiting. So just gonna
I'll try to be briefer, sorry.
yeah, maybe we need to go a bit quicker. Lorenzo is next, and then let me just go through the people I've got on my list. So people next to Lorenzo, the two people next to Lorenzo have the hand up if I got them right. And then I have Richard, Emily, Lydia, and last one there. Great. So Lorenzo, you're next.
It's called John. Thank you, David. I love the shamelessness, and I also love the metaphors.
I think you love them more than I do, but
but I do need help to understand the vision a little bit more, because first you talk about the foundations of liberalism, and we discussed about those 4 foundations. And then you mentioned that your hero is Judith Shklar with the idea of summum marum. Now, I mean, the vision now becomes a bit confused in my mind, perhaps. The idea is that the summum marum is the foundation of Shklar liberalism. So at the foundation of that liberalism, there is an evil to be avoided. You call it suffering, she calls it cruelty, but the point is that formally speaking, the foundation is an evil to be avoided. Now, the question is very simple. So what is at the foundation of your vision? Is it the 4 founding values or the summum marum?
definitely the 4 values. So I think that in this other paper that I mentioned, what I think Shklar is right about is roughly about the considerations that should guide the conscientious politician. but the conscientious politician need not be a political philosopher. So I think that for the conscientious politician, often, I have some exceptions, often they should just be guided by the need to avoid or minimize serious suffering, and that's it. But I think that in itself is what follows from the liberal fundamentals, plus some partly empirical thoughts about humanity.
Very quickly, so I just wanted to understand then, so what is the place of suffering then? I mean, then it's not a summa, it's something that derives. Is it?
Maybe
something
it may be the worst evil without being an underived negative value, right?
You're next.
Thank you so much for that very fascinating
Thank you.
talk. I'm trying to understand the motivation behind this unashamed liberalism, and it partly speaks to whether I think it comes from philosophy into politics or politics into philosophy.
It's a good question.
And I have always struggled with where those two things meet anyway. If we talk, I know you don't want to go into history, but if we look for the world's most famous referee in philosophy, it was definitely Socrates. And he made a point of the "oh really" comment and just bouncing around with that and staying there to let people percolate in what is actually real and what's justifiable. And every attempt at that time by Plato and others to actually actualize it failed abysmally. And I have a sense that whenever anybody reaches for an unashamed philosophical position, they're actually starting from politics and using the philosophy piece as a prop. Does that mean anything to you? Nonsense? No.
This sounds to me like less a question about the paper and more a question about me, which is perfectly legitimate. I'm just saying. I think in my case it's overdetermined. So I have the political motivations doing work there, of course, but I'm also just pissed by the philosophical weakness. And I think this is why I mentioned quickly in the presentation that it would have been an interesting case if the two pushed in opposite directions, right? But it's just a happy coincidence in a way that I think they push in the same direction. I should say I'm not sure that I buy the picture of Socrates as a referee, but I am really not an expert.
So the person behind Jeff, yes.
Hamburg University. A question also about the status of the liberal fundamental, but quite similar to Andreas' question. So maybe just add a wrinkle to that. If I understand you correctly, the principles you name, they have their normative status because they're true moral principles, not because they happen to also fit in the liberal tradition of because we would arrive at least would be doing the kind of Procopinian reconstruction of
none of that.
All of it doesn't matter to you. They're just too long.
Correct.
When you said in response to there that you're not committed to these being irreducible to each other in some way, and you may, I assume, at least many people may also not be committed to those being the only principles. There are probably other true moral principles. We talked about suffering, we talked about respect. I could think of more as well. I just wanted to ask if there's anything special on your account about these. Except for maybe if you think about, well, they're special in the sense that they capture the core of liberalism in some sense, but that doesn't matter to you. Is there also something special in some other way about these four?
That's a good way of putting it. I'm not sure. So one thing that came up in my exchange with Joe is that I thought of them as somehow special for liberals, so that some people who aren't liberal will reject. Whether there are others, I mean, I think in the written version I actually say that I'm not committed to it being, either exhaustive or exclusive. But the question, what's special about them is interesting. I don't think that they are necessarily metaphysically special. That goes back to the irreducibility point. They are importantly central here, right? I'm not sure what exactly to say. I think that while their validity does not in any way depend on their social prominence, their centrality to the project may. So I think I would say something along these lines. But yeah, but that's a good way of putting it. I probably should have more to say. Yeah, thanks.
Richard.
Richard Bellamy, UCL Political Science. So I wonder if I can defend the Rawlsian project rather than what Rawls himself puts in there. Because I think one way of trying to understand what he's trying to do, which I think Kevin was expressing, is he was trying to explain to the non-liberal how they should engage pragmatically with each other for reasons other than contingent balance of force. In other words, trying to say to the antagonist of the shameless liberal why they should have constraints on how they pursue victory. And I wonder, can you do without that?
So you think of Rawls or the Rawlsian as primarily trying to give the non-liberal principled reasons to endorse the thin version
A
of
liberal
liberalism.
state of a kind.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so first, this does not sound to me like a plausible reading of Rawls, but we don't need to care about that. Rawls is not primarily addressed. I mean, as I said, Kwong reads him as entirely an intra-liberal project. Maybe Kwong is wrong in that. But you go all the way in the other direction, right? Thinking that he's not even interested in talking to liberals. His whole point is talking to those who reject liberals.
Well, not reject, but he's trying to give reasons why they shouldn't reject.
Why? Wait, but I thought the point was he was trying to convince illiberals,
Non-liberals,
people who are on the fence about liberalism.
people who are conservatives, like
Conservatives may yet be liberals. That's not in the relevant sense, right? That's not.
mm.
Again, I mean, I really don't care about Rawls. For whatever it's worth, I don't find it a plausible reading of Rawls, and I also think, to the extent that I know the secondary literature, which is not full but not nothing either, it goes rather strongly against it. Here's the thing that's more important. The question how to deal with the illiberal is an extremely important one, but it's a practical one. It's really complicated. You need to understand something about strategy and about PR and about human psychology and about the limits of power and about incentives and about behavioral psychology and about God knows what else. You really think that the philosopher's book doing ideal theory is the best way to go on that?
I think actually it is to some degree.
Well,
But
zero
we
is a
should-
degree, but.
All right, well, as somebody who's defended the view of Rawls I've just put in print. So there's at least some secondary literature that maybe you've not read.
That's fair enough.
Nonetheless, I can also say that, issues such as compromise, why one should, one can, as in the same book in which I give the reading of Rawls I have tried to defend an ethical view of compromise. And I do think that that is something that at least some people think is important to do, because a purely pragmatic one is not going to convince somebody beyond the point at which they're forced at gunpoint to compromise. Do you think?
What will convince whom on what occasions is an empirical question, a highly complicated one that will receive, if any answer, a hyper context sensitive one. It will not receive one from a philosopher's armchair, however good. It can't. It's a different kind of question.
I don't think you can avoid moralizing the issue to some degree.
I'm totally with you on that. I called it on my handout a holy duty to compromise. That sounds quite moralizing. But how to compromise? Why? With whom? To what extent? These are matters that I don't see that the philosopher can help with. These are going to, and again, the problem with the philosopher during this is first that they're going to do a poor job in what they recommend. And second, that they're going to issue these constraints on what you're supposed to compromise. And both of these things are bullshit. First, there are no limits. Everything is open for compromise if worse stuff is to be avoided. And second, what's the best strategy for compromising? You think you can come up with universal generalizations about that from the armchair? I want to know who your enemies are and who your interlocutors who are on the fence are and what they are sensitive to and what they are not sensitive to. And I need to know something about the economics of all of this stuff and the psychology of all of this stuff. Reading Rawls won't help.
Emily.
Hi, Emily Wilson, starting with political science at UCL. I'm not sure how useful the question would be, but let me just offer it. I had similar worries to Andrea, and some similar worries to Richard, but let me try and push a slightly different thought. I really wanted to know a bit more about the details to understand where you were positioning yourself and what the argument was. So one of the things I wanted to know was exactly how do these four things sync up? But the other part I wanted to know more about was how do the two shamelessnesses sync up, and which do you take to be your more original point? So when you were talking about the first kind of shamelessness, the kind of shamelessness that says, I'm going to realize the tragedy of the religious community and how oppressive it is, I was thinking you sounded a lot like the comprehensive liberal. So it sounded to me like your disagreement with Rawls is fundamentally that he's a political liberal and you're a comprehensive liberal. You think these are the right values and everyone who disagrees is just wrong, and the range of the unreasonable is huge for you. They're all wrong. And then I thought maybe the weight of your argument really rested on what you meant by the shamelessness of the pragmatics. So I wanted to invite you to say a bit more about, like, is that the distinctiveness of your view, or is the distinctiveness the way that two bits of shamelessness link together, or do you reject the comprehensive liberals for reasons I don't yet see? Or
I am a comprehensive liberal.
Okay.
I think that the two liberals I know that are to whom I'm closest, at least in some ways, are Emil and Raz. And I don't think there's anything original in being a comprehensive liberal, of course, although there may be something original in the specific ways in which I would be a comprehensive liberal. I don't think there's anything original in being shamelessly pragmatic. Although I don't know of people who are, and this does go back to one of your suggestions, I don't know of people who are as clear as I think we should be about the way to combine the two, namely about being fully uncompromisingly confident in the fundamentals in a way that still not just leaves it open, but requires compromising pragmatically on everything, so long as you can get something that's a little better. So I don't know of anyone emphasizing these things in these ways, but at the end of the day, I think that this is what Mill and Raz should have said, and to an extent, maybe did. I mean, somewhat. In this bigger project that George was kind of to mention, I also say that I think some of the things that we should, that one of the tasks is to develop this kind of comprehensive liberalism in a way that is also immune to the objections that convince many people that there's a problem with it. So for instance, I think that while consent is extremely important, both morally and politically, liberals have by and large not been good enough at accommodating problematic cases of consent and what to say about them, right? So I think certainly Mill was not, and so I think we need to say more. So, but I'm perfectly happy with thinking this bigger project, funded ironically by the Israeli government, is called something like Rekindling Liberalism. So I'm happy with thinking about it on this one.
David, can I ask you, as we're approaching the end of the year, can I ask you a question in the other direction of someone who endorses shamelessness in the fundamentals and wants to carry that over to the politics? So correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that you deny the possibility of there being political, underived political reasons that would apply to government in virtue of its role and are not directly instrumental or derivative from the fundamentals, equality, sort of autonomy and prevention of harm, but nevertheless apply to the government in virtue of the fact that it does some stuff to people, like coerces them. So I'm thinking here of the view that there are first order political reasons. And maybe political philosophy should just seek to, discover what they are, and we should be shameless about that. That doesn't mean that they are all things considered. They can still be pro tanto, but there might be great value in saying we can compromise, but not on that stuff. And it seems to me, at least one tradition of liberalism has its eyes set on there have been political reasons that are not fully reducible to reasons of individual well-being. And that would be one way in which liberalism is kind of distinctive compared to other doctrines, in that it believes that there are some first-order moral reasons applying to government, political reasons or political principles. You seem to think that these are all purely pragmatic, would be the constellation of a set of pragmatic and first-order fundamental reasons. And there's nothing we can say in general, unless we know the context and unless we know the political science of it. But it seems to me it's quite plausible to say, a few things that the shameless liberal can tell governments about how they use their coercion that are not fully reducible to the four values. Raz famously said there are no political reasons, all reasons that are political reduced to reasons of individual well-being. That's one view, but it seems to me you can still be a liberal and believe that there are distinctively political reasons, and maybe that's one way to read political liberalism or other views. But do you deny that this is possible, that there might be underived political reasons applying just to government? If that's possible, then it makes the political philosopher more useful to the politician than you want them to be.
Thank you. Okay, so there was a lot there. First, I don't remember this quote from Raz, so if you find
Right,
it, is it? I'm not committed to all of these reasons being about well-being. I am committed to them being all, at the end of the day, moral reasons. Whether morality is all about well-being is a different question. It's definitely, to a large extent, about well-being, but that's a small point. Another small point and then a big point. The other small point is something, well, maybe there's a point in saying some things are such that we won't compromise about them. If there is a point to saying that, I'm sure in some context there is value in saying that, then we should say that. It's false, but we should say that. Again, this goes back to the government house kind of shameless liberalism. Are there any considerations that apply to the state or to state officials or authorities in a way that does not derive from other things? The answer is no. But that's not special to the state. There aren't considerations that apply to lawyers that are not derivable from other things. There aren't considerations that apply to professors that are not derivable from other things. There are considerations that are role specific, but they are at the end of the day grounded in some stuff that is not role specific, plus some stuff about the nature of the relevant role. I think that's true of all roles. And it's true in particular about the role of the state or of a state official.
Great. You're next, Indy.
I'm a student at Queen Mary Laws. I'm relatively new to this sort of discourse, so I'm just trying to follow, and I'm just trying to unpack in my head what happens with the fundamentals that you mentioned, and if there's any clashing or friction between them when dealing with, for example, the sexually oppressive education community. Specifically, if we were to take the second response that you said, which would entail uncompromising insistence on autonomy, and I was wondering if that could be rebutted by arguing that, say, that community, which is assigned a lot of autonomy because individualism mandates a lot of autonomy in the communities. What if we can just say that community sought to simply teach about sexuality in an oppressive manner, and how does the liberal state respond to that if it is to respect that sort of autonomy of the community? And does it, on what grounds would it oppose that? And does it look to the more long-term effects of autonomy of the individuals being taught, or what? I just want to clarify that.
I think the short answer is yes. All of these considerations and many more are relevant. So here's an example. It's possible that there is already within that community an initial opposition. And if the state supports it quietly, that will do the work with very little harm. In that case, that's what you should do. Why should you do it? Because it's tragic that people's autonomy and well-being is compromised in these ways, and because it's possible that there is already an initial opposition. It's touch and go. You're not sure that it's going to succeed, but that any support by the state will undermine its chances of success. In which case, what you should do is keep your distance. It's possible that the situation in that society, in that community, is already so shaky that all you need is one serious economic incentive and you're done. And do that. It's possible that the only way of changing that will involve an army, as I think it will in the case of ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel. If you try that, they will be willing to give their lives. Or anyway, many of them will. In which case, you should think really carefully whether it justifies the kind of bloodshed that will happen. It's possible that you will be able to introduce some reforms, but that the children who will have learned under these reforms will be compromised later on with matchmaking. In which case, once again, you should do nothing and at least be depressed about how tragic the situation is, at least recognize that. These are really, really complicated. I mean, I really think that I don't know if the main virtue of a politician is practical wisdom. It's about how to try to take all these things into account. The thought that you can assert autonomy or something weird about disagreement and toleration or whatever, and from that generate a policy that affects the lives of real people, and it is so sensitive to all of these things, seems to me like, I mean, it's not just ridiculous, it's also kind of a case of the worst kind of philosophical hubris.
So very last question.
Kim Will, UCL Philosophy. Really enjoyed hearing you talk on these issues.
Thank you.
Got many questions about this, but I wanted to circle back to point 3 on your handout, and this kind of would seem to be made with the shamelessness in 2 directions. And kind of to continue some of the discussion with Kevin and Richard before about, I'm going to put the question with a kind of devil's advocacy for the political liberals. And that is in their spirit to try to kind of suggest that maybe the distinction that you're making is not so sharp, or that they can kind of come and reconcile with you and sort of absorb you into their consensus, right?
Can I absorb them?
Well, actually, maybe they could argue that you'll come around to them in further down the track. Because I think that when I was listening to you go through the points, there were times at which you were opening the door to some points that are. So I'm going to make a suggestion in the following lines. You said that we should do ethics. Let's do ethics about this and get to the sort of bottom of the values in the vague values that you started with. Now, why couldn't the political liberal just not tell you that, well, yes, I support you to do ethics and get to the bottom of these? Now, that's why we have, civic discourse. But politics requires us to make decisions for the here and now. We have to make choices. And there are many considerations that you raised where it might take a long time to get to the bottom of these. And unless we're going to make all our decisions based on sort of expediency and political sort of prudence, then perhaps there's a role for the shameful view to say, well, here is a framework in which we can limit our disagreement, we can contain it to some extent, and sort of freeze political power from reshaping the world too radically while we're still working on sort of getting to it. So that's kind of the sort of challenge I want to put. I want to hear you sort of say more about that.
In 60 seconds.
No, yes, and no. when I say that we should do ethics, I don't mean that we should do it in parliament in 6 seconds. Right? And of course, sometimes we should make decisions in the face of the fact that we haven't yet completed that discussion to the extent that it can be completed, or in the face of time pressures and in the face of uncertainty. All of that's true. Why think that the right response to either time pressure or uncertainty is to abstract from all the stuff that Rawls would want us to abstract from? Surely the thing to do in the face of uncertainty is to try and think what is more likely than what. And then, I don't know if you're into hedging or into some others, there are other things that people write about uncertainty. Something like, well, the right response to uncertainty is to go for consensus. What would possibly justify that?
Well, the call was just if I could come back.
Sorry, no, it's really, we have to finish
Okay,
here.
I'll talk later.
Yes, please, you
I'll
can
have to
continue,
do
yeah. So at this point, both for principal reasons of gratitude and for pragmatic reasons to do with custom and etiquette, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking David for what has been a really, really